Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. And I'll say Ramadan Mubarak to those who are celebrating. My name is Susie Brown, and I am the president of the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and really excited to be here with all of you today for another conversation in our series that is a partnership with that We Are Still Here Minnesota, which we may refer to sometimes as WASH. We have MCF and We Are Still Here Minnesota have an ongoing partnership to bring education and information to the Minnesota Council on Foundations community. And we're really pleased to partner with them and glad that all of you who've joined us today are interested. And today's topic is Indigenous Education for All. We have three great speakers, Marlena, Joaquin, and Jane, and we will hear from them shortly. The format for today is that we will get some introduction from Ramona, we will hear from our speakers, and then we will engage in facilitated Q&A until 1:30. I will say that if you have a clarifying question while someone is doing their thing, while they're presenting, you can put that in the chat and we can ask them during their presentation. But if it's not a clarifying question and it's really something for discussion, we'll ask that you hold that and we'll have the broader discussion after our speakers are done with their talks. The process that we'll use for discussion is please indicate in the chat that you have a question, and I will be monitoring that while Ramona facilitates, and we will ask you when we call on you to open up your mic and you can ask the question yourself. So we will get started. First, I'd like to just recognize my colleague, Paul Masyarchin, who is the lead MCF staff for the We Are Still Here partnership with MCF. And let's see, is Joanne here? No, okay. We have partners from the Minneapolis Foundation, which is Joanne Stately. If she may join us in a little bit. And then I'll turn it over to our partner at the McKnight Foundation, Sarah, to introduce herself. And then Sarah, you can turn it over to Ramona.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Susie. Yes, I'm Sarah Hernandez, a program officer at the McKnight Foundation, and I'm also co-chair of the WASH Minnesota Philanthropic Working Group, and Joanne is the other co-chair. So I want to welcome everybody today, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Ramona? You're on mute.
Oh, I was just really going there. Hami taku yapi. Petakinde o wasing. Chante washte na pechu zapie. Ramona Kito Stately amaki apie. Damakota. De Dakota ia iupse sewing miye. Isayanti hechia taha. Wahie takawana shakpe edwati. Good morning, my relatives. I always like to begin in the Dakota language, the oldest language of Minnesota for over 12,000 years. And some of us already know some Dakota words, but I like to use that introduction. The phrase Hami Taku Yepi is addressing all of the people here as a relative, but we're also referring to everything that has life is a relative. And so that's reflecting the philosophies of Dakota people. So my name is Ramona Kito Stately, and I am the project director for We Are Still Here in Minnesota. And our mission is to spotlight and make visible the lives and contributions of Native American peoples and their governments in Minnesota today, because we are still here. We will do this by challenging and correcting false narratives, replacing fiction with facts in K-12 education, and finding solutions for issues impacting the Native American community. Our strategy includes working with or networking with organizations like MCF to spotlight important topics, and by bringing the voices of Native Americans in communities and areas of expertise. Together we can reclaim, rebuild, and bring life into a vibrant future in Minnesota and beyond. So I will start with the land acknowledgement. Makoche kinde Dakota tamakoche. This is the land of the friendly people, the Dakota. Today we acknowledge the language and the connection through it to the land. I would like to acknowledge that first and foremost, this place where I reside, Minnesota Makoche, was and is Dakota homeland for over 12,000 years. And as we have been taught, to recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose land we reside on, and a way of honoring Indigenous peoples who have the longest relationship to this place. This is, has been, and will always be an Indigenous place. In 1545, the Anishinaabe began settling in northern Minnesota, known as the Great Migration. Ever since, the Anishinaabe Nation has survived, and they currently reside on 7 reservations located through Minnesota. We acknowledge both the Dakota and Anishinaabes history, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather today. So welcome. I'm so grateful for having the opportunity today. Our discussion is on Minnesota schools and educational institutions with a focus on Indigenous peoples and tribes. We'll focus on why it is necessary to include an authentic educational curriculum written by the people of the 11 tribal nations. So our first guest today will share her lived experience as a Indigenous woman growing up in a community where she did not see her thousands-year-old history reflected in school. So let's listen to the heartwarming reflections of award-winning artist Marlena Miles. I think you can begin to understand how her work is destined to make change in Minnesota. Welcome, Marlena.
Yeah, thank you for that, humble introduction, Ramona. So my name is Marlena Miles. I grew up in Minneapolis. I'm Spirit Lake, Dakota. And as a kid in Minneapolis, I lived at a place called Little Earth, which is an urban Native community. I attended a Native magnet school called Four Winds. And my classroom was, 90% Native. My teachers were Native American. So I always felt truly represented in those areas. But outside of that, my neighborhood was maybe 4 blocks outside of that school. I didn't see anything in Minneapolis that showed that this is Dakota homeland. And every summer we go back up to the reservation, and going up there, I would see how all of our history and sacred sites are still relevant to us as people. And then when I would come back to the city, I'm like, why isn't that something that's taught here? I remember in 4th grade, they took us to Fort Snelling. In this classroom, 99% Native kids. They taught us about Fort Snelling as if it was like a pioneer's day. We saw blacksmithing, we saw what an old classroom looked like, we saw what sugar candy looked like, but nobody told us that this is basically the concentration camp of your people. And it's why I have a reservation in North Dakota, and why we're no longer in Minnesota. Like my great-great-grandmother, she was born in 1863, and that's like right after the War of 1862 when we were exiled. And it took my mom, she returned back to Minneapolis in the late 70s, early 80s. So that was over 100 years for my generation of Dakota people to return here. And so, as an artist, I wanted to create something that would make it easier for future generations so that they wouldn't have to feel like they're not seen in the Twin Cities. I can share in the chat a link to the Dakota land maps I've created. And those maps teach about the past and the present, and I'd say the future of Dakota, because it has the sacred sites, but also has present places in Dakota as well, because I thought, it's one thing to celebrate our history and historical sites, but why can't the light rail be seen as Dakota? Why can't First Avenue be seen as Dakota, the Viking Stadium? And so I labeled modern places in Dakota when I worked with my friend Owe. And, when I first created that map, I had it in my mind for a long time. And the On Being project, they reached out to me to create something to go with their land acknowledgement. And so I thought, well, here's a big organization, maybe they would be a way for me to get this out there. And when I had finished creating it, they told me to take my name off the bottom corner. And my friend Elwie, who wrote the language with me, and they said they would just credit us in the caption. And I was like, why would you ask Dakota people to create this Dakota land map for your land acknowledgement of Dakota people? And then once again, tell us to take our names off of it. And so, I got angry and I said that I'm just going to take it back. I'm going to give it away for free on my website. And I asked my friend Zoe to put audio on there. And so, I learned that generosity is an important virtue for Dakota people, and that me making this accessible to everybody, that has been, I guess, a success, because I've seen this in a lot of classrooms. I've seen it in libraries. I've seen it in Starbucks even. So it's gone a lot of places that I never imagined possible. And that only happened because of being generous. And I see this map as sort of like a periodic table in science. It helps you see how all the elements are connected. It helps you see how the relationships are built. And so this land map, I think, opens people's eyes to like the big picture of our stories that are embedded in the land. I say we have land-based education. Our data is stored in the land, like the same way your computer desktop has icons that show, if you double click it, this is where all your photos are. You double click that, where that's where Facebook is, your phone apps are. And so when I see the Mississippi River, Wakatonka, I know the connections that my people have, not just as a way to use it to transport between the different villages or the different sites that were on that river, but I also know it represents the spirit road above, because we believe what's above is reflected below. And so this connects me into like a wider worldview with my ancestors. The spirit road that we travel in the afterlife is reflected as the Mississippi River. And that's why burial mounds are all along this river. So there's burial mounds in St. Paul, there's burial mounds in Bloomington, Chaska, pretty much every city that's along either the Minnesota or the Mississippi River, they're going to have burial mounds there. And burial mounds were created through a community effort. It wasn't just one artist making something, it wasn't just one person making something, the way a lot of sculptures and stuff are created today. And so learning how our art has always been, or our creations have always been community based, and our symbols are owned by the community. So everything I do, I try to create with the community in mind, like this land map, like the educational resources I have on my website as well, because not everybody has access to maybe the internet or something, or teachers want to have authentic coloring sheets that teach about plant medicine or related to Henry David Thoreau's travels in Minnesota. Like, I created those things because those are things that we didn't have growing up, and I want people to connect to Minnesota as a Dakota person. Like, you want to assimilate us, so how about I assimilate all of you a little bit into Dakota thinking, because I think it's time for change, and for young people to have connections to our history, and that's only going to occur through land-based education. And Minnesota has so many great parks, and many of those great parks already have our sacred sites there. So, these land maps and like the Badote tours that Ramona leads, like those are all avenues for people to actually see the land as a relative. When we do land acknowledgements, I think it's important to also represent or talk about our relationship, like Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. Like, we give thanks to her. She stores our ancestors, she stores all of our stories. And like I said, like, I grew up in Minneapolis. I never felt like I was never not Dakota, but I also was aware that once people took the land from us, once they no longer had to live a Dakota way, because prior to 1851, fur traders and stuff, if they wanted to work with us, they had to marry into our our kinship society. So either they were adopted in, even Father Hennepin, he was adopted in, or they married in, and they were able to be Dakota in that sense, because our society has the Hunka ceremonies and stuff to welcome other people in. And once the treaties were signed and people took the land and could access it without us, they were never able to connect to the land the way we were. So I don't believe that relationship building should have ended in 1851. I believe that we still have the ability to connect as people, but also as human beings to the earth and Dakota people. We have those teachings. So the land map might seem simple, but I think it opens people's eyes, like the periodic table opens people's eyes to how everything is constructed. So, you know, like I never thought that the land map would be such a big thing, but I see how it has already made an impact. And, you know, it's important for us to be able to, I think, teach about our culture through art and through oral traditions. That's traditionally how we always taught, you know, how we shared our stories, how things are passed down from generation to generation. So, you know, as a Dakota artist, I feel like, you know, my importance to my people is continuing that tradition and also welcoming, you know, Dakota, non-Dakota into our value system. And that happens through our relationship to the land. So that's my little story. Sorry if it rambled a little bit, but on my website, there's lots of free resources, and I'm also getting into augmented reality, which lets people use their phone to see like the artwork I create at land specific sites, and they hear the Dakota language, they see the artwork, and they see how it's like emerged around the land. So, you know, I see the map as like a big picture view. In all the murals I create or the augmented reality I create, these public artworks, they allow people to sort of activate these stories at these sites. And like when I say something is sacred, Ramona will understand what that means, you know. But I think for other people to understand that who are not Dakota, augmented reality lets them see that through our eyes at those sites. And now, you know, I've had people reach out to me after they've done the Dakota Spirit Walk, that is at the Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary. You know, they tell me that they see that in a totally different way. They want to make changes. They want to know what they can do to, you know, honor the land, honor their relationship to the earth. And so, you know, I'll continue growing as an artist and working with different organizations. Like I'm working with the Landscape Arboretum. They do a lot of teachings to reach out to the public and teach them about their plant knowledge through their methods. And they see the value that I do through augmented reality, through Dakota plant medicine teachings. And so we're kind of combining that. You know, we have the same goal at the end of the day, but we have two different ways of getting there, and our ways of knowledge, you know, they validate each other, and so that we work together and make the land accessible to more people through different avenues of learning. So I do feel like it's important to work with organizations who have ownership of the land and how they can actually go beyond the land acknowledgement and make this accessible to Native people, but also use the land as a teacher from a Native perspective, you know. And that comes from them centering someone like me, you know, not them doing the work for me or doing the work without Native people actively being involved. So, but yeah, so thanks for having me.
Thank you, Marlena. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that your work really represents understanding the philosophical thinking of Dakota people, and what we have all grown up with is an institution and history in K-12 written by white men with no connection to place. And what we've seen is in 160 years of statehood and other people making decisions, the water in our state is completely polluted. And if you are a pregnant woman in the state, you aren't, you're told not to eat the walleye, you know. So your map really represents and helps people understand this connection to place. And so, yeah, I just so appreciate you. Thank you so much. And we'll have questions for Marlena coming up. Next, I want to find out what's happening at the national level to support Minnesota Native Nations and ensure that a full and accurate historic representation is taught in every school. So Joaquin Preston, my friend, Dene Navajo Nation and policy associate from the National Indian Education Association will share national research on which states currently have a solid foundation to move forward with Indigenous education for all. Joaquin?
Yeah, thank you, Ramona. Totoni nishli, keklahe bashishchin, klizaklane deshache, torigini deshanale, that kelena dinasha, Joaquin Preston unisha. So as Ramona said, I'm Dene, and if you're around Dene people enough, you'll recognize that we usually do our formal introduction with our clans in our language. So what I essentially did was tell you who my various grandparents were by telling you who their clans are. And in Dinewe, you would be able to make relation to me by relating your clans to those clans. And then we could even make relation to place by where those clans traditionally were home throughout the Navajo Nation. But today I wanted to just as Ramona said, give you an idea of what's going on around the United States, specifically on the state level, because a lot of the Native Education for All work, and that's what we call it, Native Education for All. It goes by other names. You'll hear Native American Education for All. I know in Minnesota, it's Indigenous Education for All. And then I think when Montana first became the first state to pass some type of legislation or policy, it was referred to as Indian Education for All. So NIEA, just so you don't get confused, we call it Native Education for All, and that's not to say that these other ways of saying it are not important or to diminish them. That's just kind of the vernacular we started to use as an organization. Excuse me. So I think the presentation by Marlena really set the stage really well in terms of how Native peoples relate to the content and curriculum in schools that they have that they attend. And a lot of our students are unfortunately located in public schools, K through 12, over 90%, and that's throughout the United States. So a lot of those schools aren't necessarily designed or have the content curriculum in mind to service Native students in a culturally responsive way, or to respond for them to see themselves within the content and curriculum. So when the Indian Education for All in Montana first started, it was really in response to a lot of conflict that was happening between citizens of Montana and citizens of tribal nations in Montana, specifically around fishing, water, hunting rights. And there was started to be some violence related to that because citizens did not understand the political relationship that the tribes in Montana had with the state and the federal government. They did not understand the concept of Native peoples as a sovereign political body, and why they had these specific rights. And that lack of understanding led to a lot of violence in some cases around those fishing, hunting, water rights. And so Montana became the first state to introduce legislation that was specifically designed to teach all students. So I like to underline that because especially strategically, when you're talking with your legislatures, when you're talking with people who don't have a solid understanding of Native American content and curriculum, sometimes they can view this as content and curriculum that's specifically for Native American people and tribes, but really it's for all students to create that base of understanding between both on the political side of how American Indian people are citizens and members of sovereign nations, but also just culturally to get a better understanding of each other, where we come from, the specific issues we have, and a lot of the commonalities that we have as people. So when I define Native Education for All, I really do see it as a movement. And here at NIEA, we see it as a national movement within states to begin to implement accurate instruction on American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian peoples in K through 12 schools. And we're typically seeing that in the form of state legislation or state board policies. And they all vary in exactly how the language of these policies are written. Some of them are say that they shall implement, and whether that's a specific official in a state education department or school district or a school board, they shall implement, they shall require, or they can mandate students be taught native subjects and standards. And when we, those specific subjects are usually history. I think that's probably universal in all the states where we see this. And I'll give you a quick snapshot of the states that are currently attempting to pass or have already passed such legislation and policies. But they can also include culture, tribal government, especially in the field of civics, because tribal nations operate out as a different governmental organization, and they can be organized different than a state and the federal government. And here at NIEA, we specifically see when we're talking about Native Education for All and the attempt to get Native Education for All passed and implemented in two very specific ways. One is the advocacy on the state level with a lot of our tribal champions and our state Native caucus members who are in the state legislature, who are really pushing for Native Education for All, as well as the community members, the grassroots members who are writing into their legislature and trying to raise awareness. And then the other side of that is, of course, the implementation, because even when a bill passes, what we've seen in some of our case studies and review, especially in Montana, who has often been seen as the leader in Indian Education for All, is currently being sued but because for their lack of implementation of that legislation. So the implementation part is really the difficult part, because it requires a lot of asks from both the state, but also Native nations to help guide and lead to make sure that things are being done accurately, responsibly, and that it's there's more tribal involvement, as opposed to, as Ramona had stated earlier, a lack of tribal control of this curriculum and this content, which can create inaccuracies or generalizations. So here's a quick snapshot of all of the states that currently have Native Education for All, like policies or legislation currently. And the little asterisks you see are states that also have standards tied back to Native history or social studies. And I think, so North Dakota is the most recent state to pass a NEFA-like bill. They passed Senate Bill 2304, and that was in 2021. So I'll discuss a little bit about what that is, what the work NIEA has done, just very briefly a little later. But this is kind of the cohort of states that are currently attempting to implement. There's certainly a lot of issues, a lot of challenges, some of them, a lot of things, lessons learned that can come into Minnesota, who I know has legislation pending in the state. And this is kind of the cohort we can see Minnesota being a part of. And I think here at NIEA, we also can see Minnesota being a leader of this cohort because of all of the knowledge these states have learned, all of the different Native advocates that have been able to reflect and see what are the best practices, what are the promising practices, what they could have done better. And I think Minnesota has taken a lot of those best practices and built a lot of policies and legislation to help support Indigenous Education for All that are also pending at the state legislature. And so I'll go ahead and I'll leave that for Dr. Hartstead to discuss in further detail. But again, this just gives you a snapshot. And this year, we actually have a lot of Native Education for All bills that are currently pending. Arizona, even though Arizona has language already on the state level regarding Native content. It's what we would consider weaker language because it says the state shall, and it really doesn't make it a requirement or a mandate that this be taught. And so there really isn't any curriculum. There's no real support for specifically non-native teachers who may just be entering the field and have no idea how to approach Native content. And this language, this bill both brings in a stronger requirement that Native history be taught in Arizona, but also develops a professional development requirement as well, that all teachers should go through a professional development plan that the state oversees. And then in Illinois, this was kind of a bit of a surprising state for us because it's not necessarily one of the states that has the highest population or density of Native American students, but it's certainly one of the states that has passed legislation similar to this around Asian American social studies. So this legislation is coming on the heels of that. In Oklahoma, I know critical race theory has become a pretty popular topic in education as of late. And a lot of the Native education orgs in Oklahoma, the tribes, decided to put together legislation specifically to differentiate some of the CRT issues that were coming out of the state with Native American history, Native American content, social studies. And so they drafted this bill, and unfortunately, this is the one bill that we know will not pass the state, and it's actually not going to be going to a floor vote. But it is, again, one of those pieces of legislation and one of those examples that we can draw on, and we can use Minnesota as a possible example of leadership for these other states. And then in Washington is another state that in my previous slide, you saw already having NEFA-like policies. And this specific bill further strengthens that by making it, again, a requirement that the state school board shall have this content and curriculum within the actual standards and available to students, because before it was not a requirement, even though the state had already built out essentially the entire curriculum for what they call in time memorial curriculum. So just to give you a quick idea of what NIEA has been up to, we are active in the states of Arizona, Minnesota, and North Dakota, and we're currently doing a couple of projects in those states. And of course, Minnesota, I wanted to highlight just so you know that Minnesota does have the backing of the National Indian Education Association. We have staff hours dedicated to working in Minnesota, and we have a bit of funding dedicated to the state of Minnesota, because I do really believe, and the organization believes, Minnesota is that leader that can come out of the NEFA the US wide movement that can really show how Native education for all can be done. And it's one of the states we are really looking towards as this, I know that a new round of asks is going to the legislature. So we're hoping to see, for that to pass this year. And I'll let, again, Jane speak a little bit more of that in detail. But we're also in Arizona working with a tribal nonprofit to develop history, because as we said, they have language within their within the state already, but they do not have an actual basis to draw upon to really implement that those asks of having Native history within the classroom, and also a white paper on Native education policy, so that the tribal leaders can use that to go to the state legislature to make their asks about Native education. And then in North Dakota, we've been focusing on the implementation of SB 2304, because like I said, it was recently passed. Now it's a matter of holding the state they call it the Department of Public Instruction to account, so that that we make sure that this is implemented, but also to provide our own training resources, professional development to teachers who we know are just entering, who are just newly having this requirement of teaching Native social studies. And for them specifically, it's a requirement that in 2025, students must have a unit which includes Native American history in their high school curriculum in order to graduate. So that kind of gives you an idea of the landscape of where we are right now in the United States. Again, very particularly focusing on the state side, but I know there's a lot of promise in Minnesota, and just being there myself, seeing the advocacy as well as just the broad level of support, the number of advocates who are willing to come out to support Indigenous education for all, I think really makes Minnesota a strong, one of the potential to be the strongest leader for Native education for all policy and implementation. So I know we'll save comments and questions until the end, but I guess I'll go ahead and give it back to you, Ramona.
All right, thank you so much, Joaquin, for updating us. And this is like the most exciting time of the year because NIEA just finished their Hill Week. And so we are probably learning the most up-to-date information that we could have. And even if we had gone in last year, this was on our agenda last year, and we just weren't able to get it together as we wanted to. The legislation failed, and so this year and this timing is just really, really appropriate. So I am quite excited to hear from Dr. Jane Harstead, Director of Minnesota's Office of the American Indian Education. And she's going to share the exceptional efforts happening to aid the state of Minnesota's Department of Education, Indian Education, to provide culturally relevant historical content in all areas and all disciplines. So we'll discuss the challenges and barriers presented, and no one knows those challenges and barriers better than Jane. And who are the ones that are the gatekeepers? And maybe not understanding the importance of telling all of the history of place. So Jane.
Unmute, thanks. So I'm trying to pull up share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure I have it on slideshow. All right. Wow. Thanks for having me today. Neo Benesikwe Indigo Indigenous Gamisquabikan and Donjaba Ida Shashkiba Gzibing in the Endanogon Ogishki Manasin. I am Jane Harstead, and I am the Director of American Indian Education for the state of Minnesota. I am from Red Cliff in Wisconsin, but grew up in Minneapolis and live in St. Paul at the moment. I am a former elementary teacher, administrator, researcher, done a little bit of many different things, but my passion lies with education and making sure that our students are doing the best that they possibly can. And so in listening to both Marlena and Joaquin, like no pressure, Joaquin, thank you. We are trying to do our best with Indigenous education for all of the state, and we are moving forward. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview about that. I will say that Minnesota has some commitments to equity that we do follow, and working for state government is not the easiest place to be working at for this. However, it is one of the places where we need more Indigenous people to have their voices be heard. So when we talk about the Minnesota's commitments to equity, our office, the Office of American Indian Education, really does look at all of the 10 commitments and try to work to provide all of these ideas and moving things forward and making sure that our students are getting what they need. So we have a vision here with that, you know, each student, American Indian student, will reach their full potentials in their school communities, and we look at our work kind of holistically, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think Ramona alluded to that. Thank you, Ramona. That we have, you know, Indigenous education for all moving forward, but we also have other pieces that are essential to that work so that we can have everybody on the same page. So we'll get into that a little bit farther as we move along. But we also really understand the value of not only the complex histories, the language, the culture, and where our students are coming from, but we have many collaborations with tribal nations, with Indigenous folks and groups around the state, and really work to see that each American Indian student is valued for their uniqueness, and really try to have school administrators and superintendents and teachers understand that as well. At this point, our team at the Department of Education is 6 people strong, which is many more than we've had in the past. At one time, the office had 12 folks, and then during the early 2000s, when there was a budget crisis, the office was disbanded, as it was not seen as something important. So we are making our way back to those 12 positions that we had previously, but we're up to 6 at this point. And since my tenure here, there's been at 2 or 3 maybe certain times, but glad to make sure that we have folks who are able to work on these items with us and move all of these things forward. So glad for all of these folks who are doing exceptional work, as Ramona said. So a little bit about Minnesota. We have, you know, almost 30,000 American Indian students by the state count, which is the count that we use. It's most accurate. We also have, you know, uphill battles to fight with the federal government on how they identify American Indian students. So according to the federal government, we only have about 15,500. Over 93% of our students in the state, American Indian students in the state, attend public schools. And we also have Indian education aid for schools that have, or districts that have more than 20 American Indian students. And it's on a formula based on how many American Indian students you have. So actually identification of American Indian students is very, very important. And we've been working on that, and we'll continue to do that into the future. So we do have, you know, some dollars and some funding at stake when we're talking about how many American Indian students we have. But we do have a set of statutes that we follow, the Indian Education Act of 1988, that says that schools need to recognize the unique educational and academic needs of American Indian students. So we really rely on some of those statutes to help districts understand what they could be doing better to support American Indian students. So our state definition of American Indian is having origins in any of the original people of North America, and who maintain cultural identification either through tribal affiliation or community recognition. So we do not require that students are tribal members. They can be descendants, first, second descendants. And so we really are trying to reach each and every American Indian student in the state. And I think this is one of those identification issues is one of those issues that the entire country is dealing with at this point. And I think that Minnesota has done an exceptional job in keeping that state count that we had before this new federal count, so that we do have the most accurate count as we possibly can at this point. And, you know, we still have to work on it. We have more things to do with it, but it's going well so far. So the Office of American Indian Education can do certain things, and there's certain things we can't. We can and we do consult with tribal nations, provide a lot of guidance, professional development to students, parents, teachers, administrators, any person who asks for some professional development or guidance. Usually we can provide it. We also look at statutes, advise the commissioner on what could change and how the statutes are interpreted, because sometimes they are up for interpretation and districts see it differently than the state. So really work on that. And also, as you will see, promoting the legislation that we have moving forward for Indigenous education for all, and other areas where we see we need clarifications in statute and things like that. We can provide resources to districts and parents and students, but we are not able to say, we're going to write a curricular resource, we're going to make one, we're going to give it to you, and you have to use it. We can put it out there and say, hey, here's a resource that you could use if you choose. But by state statute, we are not allowed to require any certain curriculum, and we're not allowed to write it either. So we work with other folks who are able to do that work so that we can get those curricular resources out. And I'll explain a little further as we go on in the presentation. And we also work with districts and try to help them understand the best practices for American Indian students and parents and engagement and all sorts of different areas. We have a specific set of collaborators that we work with, and make no mistake, this is the person or the entities that are in statute. So under Minnesota statute, we must talk with tribal nations. We must talk with the Tribal Nations Education Committee. We must collaborate with the Indian Affairs Council and urban indigenous groups. That is a small portion of the people we work with. As Ramona has said, and Joaquin as well, we work with WASH, we work with MIEA, the Minnesota Indian Education Association, we work with the Metro Urban folks, we work with a host of people. There is none of this work that we do in isolation, because it is not meant to be done that way. It is meant to be done as a community. And that is how we are proceeding with Indigenous education for all. So we have a lot of folks that we work with, and we, you know, and it's awesome because we are challenged every day to do what's right and what's best. And in that respect, it's awesome collaboration that really needs, you know, a lot of input and not just one set of people that are working on this. There's also, excuse me, a lot of parallel work going on from other entities at this point. And, you know, there are some who, you know, we work with all the time, some we work with, you know, every once in a while, and some we know that our parallel work will come together at a certain point, and then we will work together. So we have a lot of folks who are really invested in making sure that Indigenous education for all in Minnesota moves forward and in a good way. So one of the first ways that we have ensured that we have tribal history and contemporary issues in the curricular resources right now is with the required standards. So we have required academic standards in Minnesota that every teacher is supposed to teach to all of the students. And for about 10 years now, we've had this piece in our legislation and in law that says that the contributions of Minnesota's tribal nations need to be included in the standards. So that was in place first. And so we knew that each year, as we go through the revision of each academic standard area, like PE or science or English language arts, that we have Indigenous representation on those committees so that we are ensuring that we have both the Dakota and the Anishinaabe contributions in the standards. So it's in the standards, the content, the anchor standards and the benchmarks, there's content there that has the history and the contributions and contemporary pieces in the standards. And so when we were working on the legislation for Indigenous education for all, we knew we already had the basics in the standards, and that will continue to happen. Each set of standards is revised every 10 years. So it will continue to be a cycle that happens, and we'll be able to hone that to be the best that it possibly can be. So that's our first piece of this legislation. The second piece is the legislation that is in with the legislature currently. And we started, oh boy, we started by having this put in front of the legislature in 2017 and have had it in there every single year, and nothing has passed. And we had a divided legislature, so that was, you know, maybe the problem, but the, you know, everything that goes along with that. And so at this point, we do have the ability to get this passed this year. We have all of our Indigenous education proposals in one bill this year, because they've stacked up year over year, trying to, you know, clarify statutes, trying to ensure that we were doing the best for American Indian students. All of those things that have added up over the last 6 years are now in one bill for Indigenous education. And this is the actual language of the proposed legislation. It has not been passed yet, but we are very, very thrilled to think that this might be the year that all of the things go through. So really working on that and testifying before the legislature and talking with our constituents about it. But the first and maybe most important piece of our legislation at this point is to make sure that we are getting the accurate history from the tribal nations, right? So we're getting it directly from the tribal nations. So we are working on collecting what it is that the tribes would like us to write curriculum and not necessarily write it, but put it together so in a way so that it's understandable and that the tribe can say, yes, this is what I want people to know. So that is the first part. And then there's a second and a third part, but subdivision 2 says that we have to, you know, create or have curricular resources. And then we also need to have some professional development that goes along with that. And we understand from talking with educators across the state that there are folks who don't teach the standards that contain the contributions because they don't know that information themselves. They don't feel comfortable teaching things they don't know about, and they never learned it in their educational experiences. So we need to help them understand where this is all coming from and how it can be taught in classrooms. And I think Marlena's the way she spoke about the maps and the relationship to the place is going to be one of those key items that we are going to work with teachers on, because until you understand that relationship is symbiotic, that it's part of who we are and what we do, you know, we need to do that in order for teachers to be able to teach this in the way that it was designed to be taught. So we also knew from talking with our tribal representatives that part of the issue that we have with the Minnesota Department of Education is we don't have a lot of accountability for districts to ensure that they are actually doing this. And in our state, we have local control, so each district is in control of the curriculum they have. Each district is in charge of how they staff their schools and what they do with their money. So we are not able to go in and say, every district has to do this, every district must use this. And we are not able to do that. So what we can do is to conduct a needs assessment so that people are able to tell us what they need. What do they want to have done differently, or what is it, where are the trouble spots that we need to, you know, smooth over? What do we need to do to help you teach this, all of the Indigenous education pieces that we will have put together. So that is the third part of the, and it's the accountability piece, really, where we're looking at districts to say, what is it you need? What can we do for you? How can we support you? And it's something that is just integral to the whole process of trying to ensure that all students in Minnesota are learning this information. So I know we've talked about some of the challenges that we've had. First off, you know, as I said, passing that legislation over the years, we've tried it several different ways and it just didn't go. And we were told last year that anything with the word Indigenous in it or anything that promotes equity will not pass. And so we kind of knew that, you know, that it wasn't going to, and so this year is a different year at the legislature, and we are very optimistic about it. We also once, so it, as I said, it did not pass in the legislature in previous years. However, the Lieutenant Governor and the Commissioner of Education at the time, Dr. Mueller, worked together so that MDE has some amount of funding to do some of the work, even though it's not on the books yet as a statute. We know that the required standards are there, so we work and we try to ensure that those standards are being taught. How do we do that? We hired some new folks, we have some things going on, and that's in the next slide. But so we do have some money for this. You know, as you can see on this slide, I have funding as a challenge because we have some money. It is not a lot of money, and we know that we are going to, with the cyclical process of the revisions of the standards, that we are going to need more funding in the future. We have, you know, what we have for now, and we're thankful for what we have, but we are going to need more. So that's going to be, that is going to be more of an issue in the future. Part of our challenges is working with so many folks who say, like, I have something to contribute to this work, and we're grateful for that, because there are so many Indian education staff around the state who are teaching the things that the classroom teachers are unable or unwilling to teach. So we have a lot of pieces all over the state that we need to bring together, and so that is a challenge for us, but we are working to ensure that everyone is heard and that we have a place to gather information and then also to disseminate it to everyone who wants it. One of the things that this legislation is trying to do is to break that cycle of ignorance. So as I was speaking about before, when a classroom teacher doesn't know how to teach these curricular ideas, they're not going to do it. And until they know how and the best way to put that forward, and to feel comfortable with not only names and words and values and understandings and knowledge, we're not going to get our students to understand it in the way that the tribal nations, and we really know that students need to understand. So this is really trying to break that cycle of ignorance. And so we know that there are teachers and administrators and superintendents who don't have this historical understanding of the past or the contemporary issues that we face today. So we also have a piece that goes with this that is called Tribal Relations Training for School Administrators. So we are building professional development for administrators and superintendents to understand how this works and how we can do better with our American Indian students and tribal nations. That will be in place next year as well. So we have a lot of moving pieces that will work together to ensure that we are breaking that cycle of ignorance. We know that there are some things that we cannot control or that we don't have knowledge of yet, that things may happen and we'll be like, oh, what do we do about that? And as Joaquin had said, in even crafting the legislative language, reached out to Washington, Oregon, Montana, the states that had Indigenous education for all or something like it in their states, and asked the questions, what worked well, what didn't work well, or what did you forget that you should have included, and what are the pitfalls or the challenges that you ran into, so that we can try to avoid them through the legislation and through the way that we are going to implement this work. And so those state education folks have been awesome in helping us understand how to do it, and Joaquin has been helpful in supporting the work that we're doing as well. So again, hopefully there's not too many future unknowns, but it's inevitable that there will be folks who and things that happen that we were not aware were going to happen. So we're just keeping that in mind as we move forward. So at this point, we do have funding for 2 staff members. So we have one in the Office of American Indian Education, that's Anjanette Parisian, one in the Academic Standards and Assessment, and that is Sam Zimmerman. They've been working on the agreements we have a small amount of money for tribes so that we can get the information that they would like to give us. And the overarching question for each of the, we have 10 tribal nations who signed on to the agreements, is what do you want every student in Minnesota to know about your tribal nation? So as Joaquin was saying, at the beginning of this, there was a big misunderstanding at the legislature that this was just for Native kids. And we really wanted to make it clear that this is for every student in Minnesota, no matter where you live or what your zip code is. What does every student in Minnesota need to know about you? So at this point, that's the overarching question. And they are starting to go out to tribal nations and to collect that information from tribes so that we can start working on putting those curricular resources together, and then also build the professional development for the teachers that are going to be implementing this work. So they do have their own email address at this point. So all questions about that can go to this email address. And I have shared this PowerPoint with Paul, so he can send it out if that's what you wish. But they do have their own email, and are working really hard with tribal nations, traveling all over the state to see what it is that tribal nations want students to learn about them. And with that, it's a work in progress. We are going to be moving this forward as we, go through the next, forever. Knowing that our students need to have this information, our teachers need to have this information, and we need to break that cycle of ignorance that exists because we weren't taught this in our educational experiences as young folks. So, with that, I will turn it back over to Ramona, I think. I don't even know.
It's me. Thank you so much, Jane. You give me so much promise for this year, for the legislation to pass. And I was thinking about one of those challenges are the what we don't know. So as Indigenous people, we have this well, for Dakota, I'll speak for myself, but we have this, this wheel, and it's red, yellow, black, and white, and it means a lot of different things. But that black part is part of our understanding that there are things we don't know, and we plan on that. So I love that you have that in there. Excuse me, but I know that when that legislation passed in what, 2013, and it said students must learn Dakota and Ojibwe culture in every discipline, you know, I thought that was it. I thought it was just going to happen. And so what we didn't really see was that teachers don't know. Teachers don't know how to teach that. They need to be given the tools. And I am a teacher, so I believe teachers are the most amazing people in the world. It's not easy. We don't do it for the money. But I also feel like when we, you know, teachers had to learn about how to teach when COVID happened, you know, that was insane. That was crazy amount of technology, but we did it. And this is kind of the same thing. If your licensure says that you have to teach it, I feel like teachers need to step up and also figure that out. You know, we don't know how to teach rocket science, you know, but at some point we have to study it and do it. So hopefully we hear some great news. But what I'd like to know is, do we have some questions? Susie, were there
Yep,
questions?
Ramona, there's a question from Denise Mayad, and a couple people have liked it, so there's some interest from the group. Specifically for Jane, this question is about what can we do to support the legislation and what committee is it being heard in? But I might, Denise, if it's okay with you, augment your question a little bit, because Joaquin was talking about advocacy and implementation. So maybe we could also add on to that. What can we do, assuming this is going to pass, like you said it was, what can we do around supporting the implementation? And others, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll be watching it.
Yeah, so presented to the House of Representatives Education Policy Committee. The chair of that committee is Representative Lori Pryor of District 49A, and I can put her email address in the chat in a minute. But we also have some champions with this as well in Representative Keeler, Representative Heather Keeler, who worked in Indian education in her district before she became a legislator, so has a really good understanding of what is needed and necessary. And also Representative Cheryl Joachim. At this point, I think for the legislators to understand that this is important for all Minnesotans, so that we all have an understanding of our tribal communities and people in the state. And so it's Education Policy Committee, and it does have its own bill, and there's so many bills that come across my desk every day. And they change the numbers every once in a while. But if you reach out to Committee Chair Representative Lori Pryor of the Education Policy, she will know what to do, or she will pass that information on to her committee. And then there was so the question was, I'm just going to pull the chat up again. That is the committee that it's in right now. With local educators, that is, there is so much important work to be done in promotion of knowledge and understanding our tribal people. First of all, our tribal students, their families, their communities, and the way of the world that may be different than the general public, and ensuring that people in districts, and especially teachers and administrators, are aware that this is coming, and also that it's important work. I mean, this is the most marginalized group of students in the state. This is the group of students who is the furthest behind, and we have the largest achievement gap for. And part of the reason for that is that we don't know anything about us. And if districts, schools, administrators, superintendents, and teachers, if they all knew more about the way that we see the world, understand the world, and live in this world, the better off our American Indian students will be. And I say that all the time, and I'm passionate about it. That is not all. I don't always get a great reception for what I say. I mean, so there are folks out there who are like, yeah, well, if we do it for our American Indian students, we need to do it for our Norwegian students. And it's like, well, this one's in statute. If you would like a statute about teaching about Norwegians, you go have at it. But this is specifically learning about American Indian peoples in Minnesota and the contributions they've made to our state, because our history is your history and your history is our history. And so we all need to understand that and have a good knowledge base of where our people came from and who was here before everybody else got here, right? And part of that is the language and the culture and the traditions and the ways of knowledge keeping. So it's sometimes a hard sell, but that's the best thing that you can do with districts and teachers and superintendents and administrators is to have that conversation about how important it is for us to learn some of the things that we were not taught when we were younger. And I'll just stop there because I would go on for days.
There's another question in the chat from Rob about districts. Jane covered a lot of things. Rob, are there more things you'd like to ask related to district implementation?
Thank you very much. This is Rob Scarlett. Yeah, I just happen to live in the Centennial School District, and so I'm looking something very immediate that I can do, and in response to what I'm learning today. And there is a group, a celebration of cultures coming up soon in the district. So, and I know the people who are organizing it. So the simple thing, well, I guess it would be helpful, I would hope, Jane, if I ask them if they knew about the legislation, if they can they identify within their own school community the people who are responsible for implementation, and and just sort of just see that conversation has started.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you, Robert. And yes, the first thing would be to make sure that people are aware of the legislation, because I understand, having been a former elementary teacher, there are our days are full of jam-packed things, and you know, and I wasn't concentrating on legislation when I was in the classroom, but this is coming, and it's also important for them to understand that this is a district responsibility. This is not Indian education staff responsibility, because this falls under the required standards. So it is your you know, not only your equity coordinators have to work on this, your curriculum and instruction folks, and work with your parent committee, because most districts have an American Indian Parent Advisory Committee where parents of American or guardians of American Indian students can help you unfold and unpack some of these ideas and ways of knowing that districts just don't have. So you don't have that knowledge. So talking with the parent committee, but it is a district responsibility to do this work. And so they shouldn't be like charging money for the curricular you know, resources or anything like that. It should be something that happens from the district level. So that's a great start, and making sure that folks are aware of it. That would be awesome. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Jane.
Looking for resources, we do have on our website, at the Department of Education, some resources. Never enough. So there are plenty at the, Ramona's got a lot at the Minnesota Indian Education Association, at the WASH, at the Illuminative. There are so many places that have resources, and they've all been vetted. So those are the ones that you want to look for. We will have many more to come in the very near future. We just have to make sure that we are following all the rules and policies and procedures of a state institution, and getting those out to everyone. But there will be more. We do have a page on our website under American Indian Education for Indigenous Education for All, and it does give a little bit of the history and says, hey, check back for updates often, because this is an ever-moving program, and so we'll have much more soon, but really starting the work in depth with tribal nations at this point.
We have a couple things in the chat that have been offered by Heather Logelin, who many of you on the call may know. One is she's offering some resources. She's not able to speak on the call today. She Slacked or private messaged me that. But is a school board member in a state where this has been passed, and so if it has a resource there. So if some of you are thinking about your local communities and how to work with school boards, Heather at the St. Croix Valley Foundation might be a great resource in our neighbor to the east. But also there's a question that Heather asked, which Marlena answered, and maybe Marlena, could you talk a little bit about what you provided there as a resource? This is really about how philanthropy can reach out to build relationships with Indigenous communities, Indigenous groups in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned the TPO officers. So most reservations have one, and that's their job, is to preserve the history. They work with the state, they work with each other, and they also work with local communities who want to sort of do this work as well. Like in Lower Sioux, the state sort of turned over to Lower Sioux Agency for them to operate as their own history museum. And so they're able to sort of navigate these areas. And if you're looking to connect with a tribe, there's somebody that, their job is networking, their job is teaching this history. So even if they're not the person to help you, they will pass you on to the right person within their tribal organization. And if it's like a large funding issue or something that, you want to contribute, they're also in communication with other bands of the same tribe as well, so that they're being inclusive to the other reservations, or Dakota or Ojibwe or whatnot. So I always recommend them because, they are directly working with the tribe. They are usually tribal members. So yeah, those are just what I mentioned. And their emails, you could just Google like THPO and then up the state you're in, and then those people's contacts information will come up because it's listed with the government, whatever state you have. So.
Ramona, we have a question from Jackie from the Blandon Foundation. Maybe we could just ask Jackie to open up and ask it herself, and then you can navigate the answering. Jackie?
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, I'm thinking about the local Indian education professionals. The school districts in the Northeast, it varies widely on how robust of programs they have. And I'm thinking about this legislation and the pressure or the expectations that might be put on them to support their districts in implementing this, and what kinds of supports or tools are going to be available to them, especially if they don't feel comfortable in this role.
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
Good question, JC, and we are under no illusion that this will be easy for teachers who don't know. It'd be like asking me to teach about trigonometry, which I cannot do. And I would need help. So we do have, not only will we have the curricular resources, but we'll have professional development to go with the curricular resources. I imagine that there will be more professional development going on in the next year than we've had in this office for the past 5 years. And also working across the Department of Education and across the state, that 2 people for this work is not going to be enough. And we all have to work together. And I think that's part of when I was talking about the collaborations that we have with outside, tribal nations, with the Tribal Nations Education Committee, with the Minnesota Indian Education Association, with WASH Minnesota, with the Shakopee folks. We will have a lot of assistance in that arena because we know teachers aren't going to feel comfortable. Our main goal is to understand from the teachers themselves why they're not comfortable and how we could make them comfortable. And if they're not quite there yet, what can we do to get them to that point where they are comfortable? And until we start diving into that work, I don't think we're going to know everything that we need to know. So there will be like not only the resources, but the professional development and people across the state to help folks understand. We also have, like I said, the companion legislation that has tribal relations for school administrators. We also have a piece for teacher recertification. So for any teacher who has to recertify their license every 5 years, I think it is, they have to do a certain number of hours of learning before they can be recertified. Part of that process will be after this legislative session, and I'm being optimistic, that they will take some class on American Indian history and culture in the state. So there's a lot of pieces that we have to move into place in order for the entire cycle to be gone. And we know there will be a lot of support that we don't know about yet that we're going to need to learn about. So we'll address what we do know, and then we will address what we don't know and move on and keep moving from that point. It's never an easy question to answer, like what will the future bring? I don't know. But when we find out, we will address it. And we know that there will be things that we don't know yet that need to be addressed.
And I just want to add to that too, is that we have had 10 years of questions from teachers on how to align to the state standards. So this isn't a brand new conversation at all. And there are, we have invited superintendents and school boards to attend the Minnesota Indian Education Conference, which is sharing best practices, vetted curriculum. Every single year it happens all across the state. And this year, the Shakopee Badewa Kantawa Sioux community is offered an educator day, and it's a free day offered to non-native teachers to really dive in, do a deep dive and learn from native educators. It's Anton Troyer and even one of the actors from Res Dogs, Dallas Goldtooth, but to really be immersed in the culture on the reservation and to be able to learn some of those things. And that's a free full day. It actually closed in 1 hour. It was full in 1 hour. So the newest idea is to offer that again in the northern part of the state. But I think the tribes and Indigenous peoples are helping provide that training as much as possible. And also school districts have the funding and the capacity to offer professional development to teachers.
Ramona, we don't have more public questions, but somebody did send me a private question. Maybe we could ask Joaquin to just take a moment with a last question, and then you could wrap us up, Ramona. But Joaquin, you have this big picture view from across the nation. And are there any things that you can share? The person asks about implementation lessons that we should be thinking about in Minnesota, and maybe in particular, if you've seen any role for philanthropy in implementation that this particular audience should be thinking about. And then Ramona, that's the last question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I would just be emphasizing some of the things that Jane had already said, because I know they've been incorporating a lot of this into their language and legislation policy asks. But the first key component that I think Jane covered very in depth is the awareness piece. So just taking lessons from North Dakota specifically, because they just recently passed their Native Education for All legislation, that we to this day are still struggling getting the word out on not only just that the legislation exists, but the interpretation of that legislation, because there is some room for ambiguity. And that's where sometimes we ask the tribes to offer up some of their interpretations. That way we use that as a basis of where the tribes, Indigenous peoples would like to see the content and curriculum being implemented, or how it is provided. Anyway, the second one is actually very related to funding, and that is the teacher training component, the professional development component. One of the things that I've heard over and over again is that the advocates, when they were originally putting these policies together, especially in Washington, was that they wish they had put in an ask to the state for funding professional development. However, that's always continually been a challenge across all of these states that have already passed Indigenous education for all, Native education for all, is that not only most of the times they are unfunded mandates or requirements. So a lot of the costs are absorbed either by local school districts, teachers themselves creating their own content curriculum, taking the time to develop resources or find resources, but also, unfortunately, the tribes themselves, because they see that they want the content to be created in a certain way that is accurate in a certain way. So I would say there is room for on the professional development side to help develop professional development programming, but also in the content and curriculum side to help tribes in particular to develop that content and curriculum, not only that so that it's accurate, but that it's easy to use, that there's a lot of technical specificity put into it for teachers to understand and digest that information very easily. And again, that's something we've seen all across these various states, is the need for funding in professional development and in the content curriculum space.
And there's just so much to talk about. And so I just want to say, we can see school districts that are really doing a great job. And I'm going to just shout out to Osseo area schools who mandated the flags of all nations be included, to understand Native people is not a race, but as a political entity. And then they just once a year, they decided we're going to do a topic on third grade. We're going to do a topic on second grade. We're going to read a book. We're going to spend a whole day learning about this book and meeting the artist. And this year they're doing K-6 sovereignty lessons, which recently we had Sovereignty Day at the Capitol, and one of my participating jobs there was to talk to the legislators about Indian education. And it's very scary to think that our lawmakers and people making really important decisions, people in philanthropy, people in all these areas of education, know nothing or the truth about Native people. So for our Native kids, they've failed They've been at the bottom of the list in Minnesota for 50 years, so something different has to happen. But what is happening with the our tribal nations around the state, we are the 14th largest employer in the state. So if we can just get our grounding, if we can get rid of that gap and that continual stereotypes about Native people, if we can create that healing across the state, because it's not just Native that needs healing, it's non-Native who don't know the story, who feel some guilt. So these are courageous conversations. They're important conversations. And I love Susie and Paul that you invite us here to have them. I thank everyone for showing up during your lunch hour and continually come back to share this space with us as we move toward a more equitable future for all people and for the state of Minnesota. Thank you, everybody. Doksha.
Yeah.